Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. We have an Ask Me Anything College Admissions edition. And while we wait for everybody to queue into the room, again, I just want to thank you for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time and hope that it will be a helpful webinar for you to get some questions answered. We have a wide range of people here tonight, parents, students, people who are getting ready for high school, people who are early on in high school, people with kids who are seniors. So the questions that we got were great, and we got a lot of them. We'll be covering a lot of ground this evening, and I encourage you also to leave your questions for me as we go. I'm going to be monitoring the questions as we move along, and so I'll keep an eye out for them, and then I'll go through the questions that we got in advance. We got so many, I actually don't know that we'll be able to get to all of them, so I'll do what I can in terms of hitting all the different points. And if you could please leave your questions for me in the chat section, that would be great, or even the Q&A is fine, either way. So let me get started. This is, well, first of all, actually, before I get started, I should introduce myself because we have some people certainly who know who I am and others who are joining us for the first time. My name is Dr. Bari Norman. I am the head counselor and co-founder of Expert Admissions, which is a college and graduate school admissions advisory firm based in New York City. And we really focus a whole lot on understanding the colleges really well, understanding students really well, and providing honest, transparent information to students and parents so they can be more successful in the college and graduate school admissions processes. So this is part of that. This is part of our mission, is to, again, get that honest, transparent information out to students and parents so they can make the best decisions for them. So, you know, you got to be careful with generic advice, because there's generic advice and then there's what's good for you or for your child. And so we're going to speak about things more generally. Obviously, some people will have some specific questions. Follow us on Instagram, DM us. We'll do our best to answer whatever we can. But so first question, I would love to hear about schools you think are under-discovered gems. I like this question a lot. And it's interesting because I'm always surprised what people might consider undiscovered gems. You know, schools that I think are fairly well known, people don't necessarily know about. And so it really, I find, depends on who I'm speaking with, whether it's a school that's familiar to people or not. But a school that I love, that I feel like doesn't get a lot of traction with my clients, is I love Muhlenberg. I love the campus. I love the facilities. I love the people there. I love the vibe. I think people go there and come out better versions of what they were like when they came in. I just think they really do special things there. And so for me, undiscovered gems are really about places that do great things with students and have a really nice environment, and it would be nice if there's also a nice campus, but that's sort of beside the point. But I love Muhlenberg. I love Carleton, which is a place that, depending on where you are in the country, in the world, you may or may not know. It's a highly selective small liberal arts college that I think is wonderful. It's quirky. It's for super smart kids, and a lot of students who like small liberal arts colleges will really like Carleton. What's a couple of others? Again, I think it's interesting what we would call undiscovered gems. Grinnell is one of my favorite schools for the right student, of course. That's another highly selective small liberal arts college. I feel like Grinnell and Carleton are places that don't get as much traction simply because of their locations. Grinnell is in Iowa and Carleton is in Minnesota, but I've been to both campuses, and you know, they're fantastic. So I wish people would kind of open their minds a little bit more as far as location goes. So those are just a few that come to mind, but there are so many. And it really depends on who you are. What would be an undiscovered gem for you? What kind of school are you looking for? And then what are some kind of off the beaten path, or things that are kind of not typically on the radar screens of people around you in your region or in your kind of circles? And there really are so many. And there are a lot of schools, by the way, that people will ask about all the time that aren't much of anything, and that, you know, have a good reputation and have been able to kind of get some traction in that way. And, you know, there's nothing necessarily special about them. So I encourage you to do your research on all the schools that you're looking at and find out exactly, why is this a good place for me? Is this a good place to go, given what I want to do and what I want to accomplish and what I need to get there? So those are just a few. Another question I got was about how many early action colleges can a senior apply to? This is a kind of a it depends question. So in theory, you can apply to as many early action schools as you want because they are not binding. Early decision is binding. However, there are some schools that have some form of restrictive early action, and they restrict you from applying to other schools. So if you're talking about Harvard, if you're talking about Princeton, if you're talking, although Princeton this year, they don't have early. So in a normal year, Princeton's included, but not this year. They only have regular decision. But Harvard, Yale, Stanford, those places have restrictive early action. If you apply their early action, if you get in, you're not obligated to go. You have until May 1st to let them know if you're attending. But you cannot apply to any other early program, so early decision or early action, unless it is a public institution. So you can't apply anywhere early decision, but if you apply to one of those schools early, restrictive early action, but you can apply early action to a school that's a public institution. So you can apply early action to University of Virginia, UNC, University of Michigan. You cannot, however, apply early action to MIT or University of Chicago because those are private schools. Even though Chicago and MIT would let you apply to one of those other schools, they don't have restrictions on their processes. Harvard, Yale, Stanford, they have restrictions on theirs. So that's something to keep in mind. So it depends on where you're applying. Georgetown also has a form of restrictive early action, but like everything else with Georgetown, they're a bit of an anomaly. Georgetown will restrict you from applying anywhere else early decision if you apply in their early action pool, but you can apply anywhere you want early action, private or public. So there's sometimes just some restrictions to be aware of, but generally speaking, if you're applying to non-restrictive early action programs, there aren't any limits to the number you can do in theory because you're not obligated to attend if they let you in. Another question I got was a specific question, but I wanted to cover it because I think it touches on something general that would be helpful for everybody. Somebody gave their stats, their weighted GPA, their ACT, how many APs they're taking, and that they do a lot of extracurricular activities such as X, Y, and Z, and said they're interested in the University of Chicago and what are their chances. So the numbers are only a very small piece. They're an important and crucial piece, but they're only a small piece, particularly at highly selective schools. So you kind of need a certain level of academics, whether it's we're talking about rigor of curriculum. That's super important that a lot of people don't really think about too much, but rigor of curriculum based on what's available to you at your high school, GPA, and then also your scores, assuming that you're applying to a place that requires them. Now, University of Chicago, even pre-COVID, was test optional. And that's another question that came up later that I'll touch on. Test optional does mean test optional. What that means, though, is that you will not be penalized if you don't submit scores. They'll still consider your application and give it full consideration. It doesn't mean that it might not benefit you to submit scores, particularly if you can score within the range or toward the higher end of the range of whatever school you're applying to. So when it comes to saying, what are my chances? I think what you can do with the numbers is you can kind of say, are you potentially in range academically? But whether or not you have any chance at a school in a lot of ways is not so much related to that. You need to kind of clear that first hurdle. But once you do, decisions are really made on the softer factors. They're made ultimately on essays, on how the profile comes together, on whether or not they think you're a good fit for them, which has nothing to do, by the way, if you think they're a good fit for you, because of course you do. That's why you're showing up in their pool and potentially applying early. So the numbers are not really going to guide you in terms of like truly how good are your chances. That really comes from asking someone knowledgeable about the school and about you, whether or not you're a good fit for the college from the college's perspective. University of Chicago, which this person asked about specifically, happens to be a super specific place. And it's easier in a lot of ways to spot a U Chicago kid than a lot of other schools, particularly, it depends how well you know schools in general. I love the nuances. I dig super deep and have spent like years and years and years getting to know the schools and differentiating. And I love seeing the patterns we see in the admission rates for students who are in range, but who they take and who they don't. And it informs every bit of counseling that I do. But Chicago Chicago is an easy nut to crack. You know, they're fairly clear and open about who they are. They do it in their supplemental essays, and they do it when they talk about themselves. Most colleges don't do that, however. So when it comes to chances, yes, you need to look at the numbers, but more importantly, in a lot of ways, because some kids are going to get in who are on the borderline or who are outside the numbers, and plenty of kids who have the numbers will not get in. So most importantly, you really want to talk about fit and how well can you execute in your essays to make all of this come across. So I can't really answer any questions about chances without knowing a student really, really well. Next question is, with very few opportunities to participate in extracurriculars, what can students do to stand out to admissions teams? This is a great question. It's very of the moment. So because of COVID in particular, a lot of students' extracurricular plans kind of went out the window. And colleges truly do understand that the pandemic was at best disruptive to students and to all of us. There was no expectation in the spring that you were going to be continuing your activities. Everyone was just trying to find their footing and kind of figure out their way in the new world. And so it was fine to pause if you did in the spring. But by the time we got around to late spring and early summer, most of the places that had locked down had opened up somewhat, if not a fair amount. We were wearing our masks, and there are restrictions that still stand, but we were moving about in a way that we weren't in March and April, and even for some parts of May. And so colleges are very much expecting that students will have been productive with their time. And that's really the name of the game. What you did may look very different from what you were planning on doing or what you expected to do. So your profile might not look as sort of perfectly curated as it would have been had the pandemic not come along. But it's not the case that they expect, well, there was a pandemic, things got disrupted, there were a lot of cancellations, I can't really do extracurricular activities. They absolutely are expecting that you're going to be doing something with your time. Again, you may have zigged and zagged a little bit, as opposed to that sort of very sort of fine and clear line that you were kind of drawing between all of the different things that you were doing pre-pandemic. But nonetheless, they do expect that you're doing something. And our students have been very, very creative and proactive in figuring that out. So I have a student who actually got an internship, a virtual internship with an assistant DA. And that wasn't even what she was planning on doing pre-COVID, but the opportunity came up. They launched this virtual internship. She applied for it. It's a student who's super interested in the criminal justice system. It was better even in some ways than what she had planned. And so that was wonderful. I have other students who ended up working, in a cafe, and were not planning on doing that at all, but ended up working. And colleges love when students work. And so she didn't go on her internship in Paris, but she ended up working locally. And I can tell you that colleges are going to love that. So, people have done all different sorts of things. They've stuck with what they were doing and pivoted to virtual. For some people, depending on what they're involved in, that's also worked. And some people have started entirely new things and tried new things that certainly make sense in some way for them, but again, weren't quite part of the original curated plan. But the most important thing to remember about extracurriculars is that you should be productive with your time. And for anybody listening out there where the pandemic touched home, where anybody was ill or God forbid passed away, if you had to take on additional family responsibilities, you'll be able to mention that in the application, either through the optional COVID essay or certainly in the activities grid. So you'll be able to account for that as well. There's a couple of live questions. Let's see, let's take a look here. So are highly selective schools less likely to accept multiple qualified applicants from the same high school? Should that be a factor one considers when choosing where to apply early action and early decision? This is a fantastic question. Thank you to whoever asked it. So I get asked this question all the time, and bear with me while I work through all the different pieces of it. So my short answer for you is no. So they're not less likely to take multiple applicants from a single high school. Colleges want who they want, and they're going to take from the high schools that can offer that to them. Some years a particular high school may be able to offer them 7 great applicants. Next year, maybe only 2 kids are going to be of interest to a particular school. Now, one thing that I hear all the time is that my high school has a very good relationship with this university, or my school does not do well at this other university. And that very well may be the case. But the question is why? It's not because they have a good relationship and they're like doing favors for any particular high school. Again, it goes back to what kinds of students does a particular high school tend to churn out, and what kinds of students am I looking for at my university. And so I definitely, do more business with some high schools because they have more of what I want. But it doesn't mean because in most years we might take 7 students, that every year we're taking 7 from that school, or even multiple. It's going to depend who presents themselves and how they present themselves. And so you'll see high schools that might do generally well at a particular university, but that's again because they tend to produce students like they want at that particular college. What's an example of that? There are certain high schools who will churn out more creative thinkers, people who think outside of the box, students who are more intellectual. A college that is more like that is, you're going to see there's going to be a natural feeder from that high school to that college. But the onus is always on the applicant, because you can find the perfect school. You can find the place that feels right for you. You can find a place where the college itself is going to feel that you would be a good fit. It's a good fit on both sides. We see it. But if as the applicant, you don't execute properly in your essays and throughout the application, including that activity section that's so restrictive in so many ways, you're not going to make it through. The polls are just too competitive. And if they can't see it, if you can't make them see it in a more distinct and subtle way, then you're going to have a hard time kind of getting past the competitiveness of the applicant pools. So it has to do with, do you think you're a good fit? Did they think you're a good fit for them? Which has nothing to do with whether or not you can do the work, by the way. The academic review is entirely separate. So when it comes back to the question, are they likely to accept multiple qualified applicants? Qualified, if you're qualified and if you've executed properly, you have to get out of that realm of thinking where just because you're qualified to get in, that should really have any bearing on whether or not you will or not. Because in highly selective pools, they have so many more students than they need who are actually qualified. So then you have to go past that and figure out, is this the right place for you to show up in ED or EA, or even regular for that matter? It should be very, very strategic. And the more selective the school, or given if it's a highly selective school, the more intentional you have to be and the more knowledgeable you need to be about both yourself and the school that you're applying to. So I wouldn't be discouraged because other students are applying. I also get asked the question, well, there are already 4 people applying and they're all 4 legacies and I'm not. That's another thing that comes up all the time. Listen, there are colleges we know where legacy counts and it counts more in early, and people who want to go there who are legacy applicants are smart to show up at that point. That gives them their best shot, but it doesn't have anything to do with you and your shot. It's not like they say we have 5 slots or we have 4 slots and here we are, 4 legacies. Oh, they're all 4 legacies. We've got to take them. 4 slots filled. Can't take anyone else. I never tell my students really I can't think of a time where I told a student, don't apply there because someone else is. If I think that they're a good fit, if I think that we can get the essays done, then it doesn't scare me that somebody else is applying. So it depends on how well you can execute and how well you fit, not only from your perspective, but from the college's perspective. So don't let that deter you, is the short answer to your question. But you do want to think about, again, whether or not the college will be likely to feel that you are compelling and how well you can execute it in a more nuanced and subtle way in your essays. So the job is on the applicant at the end of the day. Another question that came in live is, this is a great question. Do some schools reject highly qualified applicants because they believe the student will not attend if accepted? For instance, don't waste a spot on certain applicants. And if so, how do you factor this into your list? This is another fantastic question. So yes to this question. This is a yes. So this is one of those kind of urban legends that actually has some truth to it. So there's 2 things here that come to mind. One is that one thing that you will see when you hear, our school doesn't do so well at a particular school. Usually that has to do with the kinds of students who are applying. Even if your school tends to produce students that might be a good fit for that college, if they're not showing up for a particular school, then it doesn't really matter that your school could, in theory, provide them with a lot of applicants. They're not. Or if you provide them with applicants who aren't doing their job as in those essays and in their applications themselves, it doesn't matter. But if you're a high school, and you've been they've been getting a lot of applications from your high school, a college is taking students, they find students they'd like to have on campus, and nobody ends up enrolling. That is where you will find that they will stop taking students. And I've seen it plenty of times from all different sides of the process. So if you're a high school that's continually having students apply, a college is taking students, and then nobody ever comes, you'll start seeing after a certain number of years, they stop taking students because they realize people aren't going to come. It's the same thing at play with part of what's been asked in this question, which is overqualified, let's just say. So students who are really high outside of the range for, let's say, scores and grades, are they not going to take those students? There, it's more of a mixed bag, and it depends on the school. So some schools play more of this game than others. Every college is looking at yield because it plays a big role in the US News rankings. And it's important for them to know how many students they can expect based on the number of offers they give out. They have to have enough space. They have to have enough people who enroll. All those things are coming into play. But they also need some of those people to bring up their scores and to bring up their averages so that they can take students who would be more likely to come, who might have lower numbers. And so it really depends on the school, the extent to which they sort of play these games as people on this side of the process kind of see it. So you can't go just on the numbers. So I always tell students, if you have a school that you feel is a safety school, a school that I say, for me, a safety school is where, like, I'll fall off my chair if you don't get in, even though we of course have no guarantees. But in order for a place to qualify as a safety school, it has to be a place that does admissions more straightforwardly. So there are a lot of places that on one of my students' lists, we might in theory be able to say this would be safe, but we know that going into regular decision in particular, that in fact it might not be, because they may look at you and say, this person is so unlikely to come, we're not going to waste a spot. So it's going to depend. This is where essays come into play too. A lot of students will see an optional essay, for a school, and it's their safety school, and they say, I don't need to do it. Or they don't even they do it, but they really do a kind of like really, really basic job with it. You need to show love to your safety schools too, because they too have plenty of people at all different levels, who are there to apply. And so if you have somebody who has the high numbers, who puts effort into the application, does the optional essay, and actually does it well, of course they're going to take that kid compared to the person who just phoned it in. So, there is some truth to this, whether or not they take students who are outside the numbers. But remember that they need to take some of those students too. And some of those students are going to show up in pools looking for merit scholarships and actually will attend, or are applying because they really love a school and, maybe are a little bit less concerned about, which one is the best one or has the lowest admit rate, and might end up enrolling just because they feel it's a wonderful match. But, generally speaking, we know that students are being fairly strategic about it, and colleges are being strategic about it as well. Another question that has come in is, thank you for hosting this webinar. My pleasure. Thank you for being here. Can you ruin your chances at a highly selective college if your essay isn't compelling, or rather, the weakest link in your application? Grades and SAT scores above the norm or at the high end of the norm. How stellar does the essay need to be? For me, in my experience, the essay is the most important factor. It's the one time the student actually gets to speak, and if you're lucky enough to have supplements, you get a few more times to speak, or maybe one more time to speak. But the essays are really where they get to know you. I mean, if you can imagine, and I used to read applications as an admissions officer, and I see so many essays every year in draft form and obviously in final form, and over the years collectively have seen thousands of essays. When you're reading, applications over and over and over again, you can be kind of testy about it. You need good stuff. You're reading quickly. You've got a lot to get through. There's so much that's so incredibly boring and so incredibly generic. I think that there's a real misconception of what a unique essay is and what specifics mean in the context of, particularly in the context of supplements, but it comes up in the main essay as well. And so if you all you had were grades and scores, right? And you had a beautiful transcript, really high scores, I can tell you flat out that that's not the compelling part of an application. That's just sort of, okay, this is somebody who we can actually consider. This is somebody who, you know, who we want to kind of really bring into the conversation. But just like a strong record, there's nothing compelling about it. There's no reason to pick any one person over another. It's just numbers. And, you know, and there are plenty of kids who I've read as an admissions officer and even in draft format, you know, working as a counselor, who have impeccable transcripts and impeccable testing. But then when you read them, they just fall flat. And sometimes we have to work extra hard with students who are reading flat, as it's said in admissions. And so again, you can have great numbers, but that's not what's going to get you in. If your numbers are too low, they can keep you out. But high numbers are not going to be what gets you into a place that's highly selective, at least, or even just highly selective for you. If it's a place that's somewhat of a reach, right? It doesn't have to be the top Ivies, you know, for this to be the case. But if you have high numbers for a particular school, but the essays aren't there, there's just going to be nothing to compel them to admit you. And they have just so many extra students that the competition is such that you need to show up for the essays. And it's not just about making them specific and unique, it's about them feeling authentic and reading as authentic. So I think so many people also will tailor them as they know they should, but they come across as overly rehearsed, and they come across as kind of a kid saying what they think the college wants to hear. And there's a big difference between presenting authentically and presenting as if you're performing for me. And I always say, once they know you're performing, you know, you're kind of done. And so I think the essays are extraordinarily important. And I know they are from being an admissions officer myself, and also because I just see over and over again my students getting into places when they're on the borderline, or even again, students who are in range. Everybody sitting here knows countless examples of kids who were in range, who seemed perfect and great, and you wonder, why didn't they get in? Well, you should probably look at their essays. That's probably the first place you look. And when I get a student who comes to me after the process is over and they say, we're on all these wait lists, or we didn't get in last year and we don't know what went wrong, here's the, you know, everybody will run down the numbers really quickly. And when I hear super strong numbers, and, you know, people generally have decent extracurricular activities, I always say, I need to see the essay. And in every single instance, it's clear immediately that that's where it was. And I've worked with multiple students who sat it out after getting undesirable results the first time around. They didn't work with us at that time. But they did the process. They didn't get any good results. They decided to take a gap year and reapply. And I've helped students reapply to the same schools they just got rejected a few months before from. And all we did is change the essays, because there's nothing else we can change. They were, you know, shut out of a wait list or denied in, you know, whether it's May, June, whatever. And then they come back a handful of months later with nothing new except for new essays and get in. And so you can see right there that it's absolutely the essays. And so it's a super, super important thing. I encourage you to spend a lot of time and care on them, and to really know what it means to be specific and to be tailored without still being generic and overly kind of like performance-based. Back to questions that came in, and please continue to send in your questions live, but back to the ones that came in advance. So is it true that many top 20 colleges are taking up to 30% less students this year, such as Princeton, and most taking ED only? So first of all, places aren't taking ED only. We're expecting that colleges in general are going to rely a bit more on ED than they have in the past, or that they do in typical years. But they're not going to only take students in early decision. But we know that early decision gives students a leg up in terms of chances for admission, and this year will be no different for that. As far as the question about 30% fewer students and things like that, that's coming from some of the deferral statistics that have come out of the highly selective schools. Harvard announced 20%. Other Ivies have announced 5- and 7-fold increases in the number of deferrals. So depending on on the school you're talking about, we really saw those high numbers at the more selective schools. I don't think it's going to be a tit for tat, like 20% of the incoming class deferred, and so they're going to take 20% fewer students. It will not work that way. But I do think that it's something that will impact the admissions profile for this coming year, in some way. And I think it will depend on how big the pools are. It will depend on a particular school's numbers for international students. It will depend on how many students took leave in the upper class years, because that's also something. And how full were they able to make their class from their wait list the year prior? That's also a big piece. If they weren't able to make their class because they dug into the wait list and then stopped, that's different from being able to fill the entire class from your wait list and then starting with an additional, whatever number of students they have who had deferred. Also, some colleges are better able to absorb additional numbers of students. So certain colleges can more easily absorb students. If they have 100 extra students, it's not ideal, but they can do it. Colleges over enroll all the time. The people who are figuring out the yield don't get it right, and you have, whether you have 10, 15, 50, 150, all those numbers have happened at schools in the past, and they had to make it work. They've contracted with hotels nearby and turned them into residence halls. They've not knocked down a residence hall that was going to be knocked down. They waited a couple of years and then used it. There's all different ways that they can kind of make things work. They can put incentives into housing off campus to upperclassmen and use upper class dorms for underclassmen. So it really is super specific to the school. But I don't think it's going to be like a tit for tat kind of thing, where if there were 20% of first years who deferred, they're going to take 20% fewer students. But I do think when the numbers are that big, we should expect some impact. And we'll see based on also how big the pools are this year, which we expect many of them are going to spike because of test optional. And so it'll be interesting. Colleges don't even know what they're going to get in terms of numbers and how many are going to show up without test scores. So until we have more data there, we won't know for sure. The next question for juniors: will juniors need to take the SAT and ACT, or will they get a break? I wish I could tell you to just forget about it, that we're done with the test, but that's not the case. Even for seniors this year, I'm not telling people like just forget about them. Test optional means test optional in the sense that you won't be penalized if you don't submit scores. But when colleges went and said they were test optional, that wasn't code for like free pass, just forget about them. You don't need to be traveling across 3 states to go take the test. But most students who have wanted to test have been able to. Maybe not exactly at the time they wanted to, maybe not the frequency they wanted to, but nonetheless, they've been able to test. And so if you can provide scores that are well into the range, at the upper end of the range or outside of the range for a particular school, you very well should. That is a good thing for you. It's also going to make it easier for you to predict your results, because when you have more data points, we can look at it in a way where it looks more typical and more familiar. With students who are applying test optional to places that normally do not do test optional admissions and have an overload of students without scores, it's just going to be harder to predict. This is also where essays are going to come into play even more than they normally do, if that's possible, because they're not going to have the scores. Many students are going to come in with some bit of grades missing as well. That to me actually is less important. They've got plenty of grades from the first 2.5 years of high school and from senior year, which have always been the most important grades anyway, where the first part of senior year, especially for highly selective schools where they look closely at those. But yeah, it's certainly not a pass. And for current juniors, some juniors have already tested and started testing. That tends to be students who can go in early. They have strong scores to begin with. They go in, they can kind of be one and done, or at least have the possibility of being one and done. If you're a junior out there who legit needs help and prep, which is, by the way, almost everybody. But if you're a student who kind of needs the time and needs the preparation, and you're running in to take tests now because you're worried about closures in the spring, save yourself the anxiety and the effort and like the time, because if you're running in to get test scores before you're at your prime, when you can get a usable score for the schools you want to apply to, you're doing yourself no favors by grabbing a lower score. So you're going in and taking the test, but if the score isn't really going to be usable for you, there's really no point. If we get to the spring and it's worse than it is now, and it's just blanket closures across the board, you can't take the test, then you're going to be in the similar situation now where it's truly going to be optional if you can't get to test. I've given up on being, a forecaster with any real measure of specificity in the midst of Corona. But what I would say is, as best we can, we would suspect that given the rest of the fall and into what's left before we hit winter and what might be a tough time in terms of the virus, but when we have spring, when we have summer, and when we have next fall in front of us, and by the way, fall of senior year is a very, very common time for people to still be testing, because if you're a person who couldn't hit where you think you can really hit realistically, but optimistically, but realistically, if you're a person who wasn't able to hit where you thought you were going to hit at the end of junior year, of course you're going to go in at the beginning of senior year and see if you can eke out that extra point. I had a student today who got back a score, who went in for the last and final time, rolling her eyes the whole time. I totally got it, but we said, listen, if you could go in and get this extra point, it's going to be really meaningful. And what do you know? She got it. It was well worth the time. And that happens so often with seniors. You take the summer off. They're not tutoring the whole summer. Take the summer off, take a break from prep, let your mind relax and regenerate, come back a little older, wiser, smarter, and more refreshed. And they go in, they do a couple of sessions for brushing up so they're not so rusty and with the test itself, and they can go in and get a meaningful improvement. Of course you're going to do that. We all want it to be over as soon as possible and be done with it at the end of junior year. But again, if you don't have the score you need, you're going to keep at it. And so be mindful when you're taking the test. The goal isn't to take it as many times as possible. It's to go in intentionally when you're ready to do it. So for juniors who are driving themselves mad because they can grab a spot now, but they're not actually ready to grab a usable score, like, save yourself. Just don't worry about it. Plan to test in the spring and plan to need to be flexible, because you might have to be, but you can handle that and you can navigate that, so don't give up on these tests because the colleges haven't. And by the way, I can write you the headline now in advance. There's going to be big headlines coming up in the spring and in the summer about X, Y, and Z college who are now test optional permanently. You should expect that. Colleges are going to realize that they can, have more flexibility in how they make decisions, and they can do certain things that otherwise they can't do without scores. And they're going to keep the test optional program in place. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't submit scores if you can give them scores, but it does mean that there's going to be some flexibility. And then of course, there are going to be plenty of colleges who go back to wanting scores and requiring scores. But don't be surprised and don't think it's a big shift right away. When you hear a lot of colleges who end up keeping the testing optional. I do think that we've made an enormous shift in terms of testing, and I do think that we're going to see more places go optional faster than we would have seen them go optional. But that said, again, for you in particular, you have to think about whether or not you're the kind of person who should be thinking about submitting scores or not. A question about essays, just sentimental essays, yes or no. To me, sentimental essay, the word sentimental suggests something to me. I would say just no. I don't know if we're defining sentimental in the same way. I think you can write about something that is sentimental to you, but I think if you're writing about it in a sentimental way, then that usually isn't the best way to go about it. Also remember that essays, the topic is always you, no matter what you would think you're actually writing about, if you're writing them well. And so if you're writing about something sentimental to you, it won't be sentimental in terms of the approach if you're actually writing it about yourself and not about the thing, that you've decided to use as your story arc. Another question, this one is about when kids can visit colleges. So believe it or not, there are many colleges that are doing tours in person right now. Most schools that I'm aware of are not. They're on pause, but you can go to Tulane, you can go to University of Miami, you can go to Colgate, you can go to a bunch of schools. Oftentimes it's just one family at a time, but you make a reservation, but there are on-campus formal tours going on. Some restrict access to buildings. You can't go inside of anything, but tours in general weren't like usually, you could go into buildings, but they were mostly about getting around campus. So it doesn't feel all that different in that regard. So you can also go and self-tour, by the way. And I've been on campuses since COVID and walked around and talked to students and even went into buildings. You know, you have to wear a mask, as you have to probably wherever you live anyway. And, you know, you see a lot more students outside. That's starting to change with the weather, but you'll see tents out, you know, for classrooms, and you see kids outside and classes outside. But there are ways to see campuses now especially if you're a senior and you feel like you really need to get in a visit before deciding, for instance, if you want to apply early or not, or as you're kind of sculpting out your list and you need to figure it out. But in addition to that, colleges have had to step up their digital and virtual content. And there are some really, really awesome programs out there that weren't out there before. And admissions officers are more accessible than they've ever been through these virtual content, this virtual content programming. And so I encourage you to do those programs and to subscribe to their admissions Instagrams, follow them on stories, listen to their lives, see their student takeovers. And by the way, this is like the most access you'll ever have to admissions officers through these virtual programs, even at the Ivies and places like it. Admissions officers are really, really accessible. So take advantage of that. You might not be able to get to campus, but you can access some other things that you wouldn't have been able to access before. But following Instagram accounts is one of the best ways to really distinguish between schools that otherwise seem quite similar to you, especially because students do a lot of the content on there. And so you can really get a good sense. And colleges, by the way, are tracking when they send you emails and there's clicking and things like that. They're absolutely tracking that. That's a way for them to track demonstrated interest, which would have been the case even pre-COVID. But now, because so many people can't or won't feel comfortable visiting campus, or there are no campus tours, so people won't visit campus, or they have no record of people visiting campus or going to a college fair or attending an in-person event at a high school or at a local hotel or whatever it might be, this now is becoming for many schools like their only barometer for demonstrated interest. And so make sure that you're clicking through and that you're, you know, clicking and watching videos and letting them go and watching them full length and interacting in those kinds of ways, because it absolutely does count. Another question, there was a question about the FAFSA, and I'm an admissions expert. I know about financial aid, but I know very little, especially relative to my knowledge about the admissions process and selection process. And so I'm not going to be able to answer specific questions about the FAFSA or the financial aid process. There are certain things that I can answer, and I'm always happy to, but this falls outside of my expertise. The question was about, by the way, just needing to fill out the FAFSA when you're applying for merit scholarships. I know it's sometimes yes and sometimes no, but I couldn't give you the nuances as to when and why, and so I don't want to give an answer to that. But I do see that question, and I am intentionally not answering it, because I want to be able to do so to the best of my ability. Another question here, I'm on trimesters. First term ends November 20th. Will my early action school with an 11/1 deadline and mid-December decision request my grades from term 1? Typically, they will ask for them. They'll call your high school, or your high school should have a sense, because you've been on trimesters for forever probably, and they know kind of what to do with the colleges, either to give them a progress report or just to wait. And by the way, you know, 11/20 is definitely on the later side. You know, you're well into them reading, but they're not reading all applications on day one, far from it. And so I would talk to your school counselor and ask how they've handled that in the past, because the desire to have first term grades at highly selective schools is nothing new. And so they most definitely will have a procedure for that as to how they handle it. And so I would just ask them directly. Another question here, if the grades are improving in senior year, should we wait for regular decision instead of early action? This is a very specific question depending on the student. In some instances, we would advise to wait. The real question is going to be, you know, if you can ask somebody who's knowledgeable about the student as well as the schools that you're thinking about for EA, what is the relative benefit of waiting versus not? So if the grades are improving. It depends by how much. It depends what the rest of the years look like. It depends what the scores look like, or if you're submitting scores. It depends on the fit piece. It depends on a lot of things. But if everything is in order, but you're looking for a slight trend up in grades, it'll be a little trickier to figure it out. But you have to talk to somebody who's knowledgeable about the particular school or schools and about you. In some instances, it will make sense to wait. But in plenty of instances, it wouldn't. We would say, if you get one more, grade higher, this isn't going to make a measurable difference. Take the benefit that you're going to get from early action. It should be enough, or it might not be. So speak with a counselor who's super familiar with the school, and they should be able to help you with that. A couple of other questions that come in through chat. Let me make sure that I get to those. Is it true that the visit counts as part of the application? Oh, and this is from a friend of mine from high school. Thank you for the question. I don't want to say the name in case people want their privacy. So, but is it true that the visit counts as part of the application as a show of interest? Do you see that changing? So I just mentioned a little bit about clicking and clicking through and all of that stuff. That's important. Visits are the same. I would say though that at this particular moment in time, don't rush to a campus and get on a plane if you're not comfortable, or drive for 5 hours, to say, oh, we made it to campus. These digital and virtual opportunities are good enough and are just as good as far as demonstrating interest at this time. It also depends what year you are. If you're a junior, I would say, listen, again, got to be flexible, but we're planning on doing visits in the spring. Hopefully things will be open enough and it will be comfortable enough to do so. If it doesn't, plenty of students are visiting even still in a normal year in the fall of senior year, because they saw something a long time ago. They need to kind of confirm for themselves that this is where I want to go early, or they're choosing between 2 or 3 places to decide where to go early, and they need to go back. There's like a ton of reasons people return for second or even sometimes third visits for themselves as seniors, and sometimes even are doing first visits because they didn't get to everything they could in the spring, or something came on their radar screen in a way, after spring, and now they want to go take a look. So visits absolutely count as demonstrated interest. And I would say, generally speaking, in a normal year, they're like the gold standard of demonstrated interest. And I don't see that changing. I do see, though, these virtual opportunities counting more. So I don't see the visit on campus necessarily becoming less impactful, but I do see the virtual options being taken more seriously and being looked at more carefully. And I think students now, because it's what we're used to, and colleges were forced to come up with actually, hopefully by this point, good programming virtually, and they'll get better at it next cycle. They learned, from the spring, and they're learning now, and they're going to learn again. They're absolutely going to keep this virtual content. They can reach so many more students than they ever could as opposed to just one-to-one visits or in-person visits. So this behooves them tremendously, and they're going to keep at it. They're going to reach students they never could have reached at all corners of the market. And so that's what I expect to change, is that this kind of interaction will have bigger impact and will count in a way that it didn't previously. Another question is, were there changes regarding ED recently? We heard that schools can't hold a student responsible if he or she changes their mind. I know nothing about this. You still are signing that early decision agreement. Parents have to sign it. Their school counselor has to sign the agreement. I have seen no changes with regard to early decision not being binding. By definition, it is early decision. What we have seen is some colleges add early action this year, giving students the opportunity to apply early but not be bound. We saw places add ED2 that didn't have it before, a second round of early decision. That's something that's new, kind of for some of these schools. It's precisely to give themselves another option to start kind of filling out their class if it doesn't happen for them to the extent they want in ED1. It gives them access to some more applicants who wouldn't show up in the first round of ED, but don't get into their first choice and are still going to be great applicants for them. And so there have been colleges that have opened things up like that to give themselves more flexibility, but nothing with regard to changing the terms of any of these application plans. So yeah, I would say that if you're applying ED somewhere, you should expect that you will be held to attend if admitted. There's been no change there. One of the things that's really funky, and it's hard to surprise me in admissions after all these years, but there are a couple of schools this year that have said, we're going to see how ED1 goes, and then we'll decide if we're going to do ED2. And that is really, really interesting. And you can just see how schools are really operating in terms of figuring out what works for them and what they need in terms of being able to fill their class. And so that was a funky thing that even for me, I was like, wow, if somebody would have come to me and told me that, I would have said, you must have misheard. And in fact, that is the case. And so, there are always changes afoot every year. This year, there are some things that we don't typically see, but again, nothing that changes the very definition of early decision. Another question from before we started: do the universities monitor your online behavior, like virtual tours and opening emails? Yes, they do. Some care more than others, but they're all tracking it, and it's all part of their rubric for figuring out, what the chances are of a particular student enrolling. Your engagement with them tells them whether or not you're likely to attend. Students who just show up with an application, who have never been to a college fair, never filled out a little card at a visit, never signed up for an email newsletter, who never attended a virtual session and then just apply, are called ghost applicants. They're just people who kind of appear, and there's no reason to think that those students are going to have a high intention of enrolling. And so it's not to say that you can't get in if you're a ghost applicant. Some schools don't track interest and don't really care, but I would say most schools do track interest in some way, shape, or form, and some more than others. The Ivies, generally speaking, because people often ask about those schools, they care less. They just don't really need to. A lot of them, some of them don't even ask, in their supplements, why do you want to go here? They don't really care. But at the same time, the more you engage and interact with the school, the better you're going to know it, the better you're going to be able to ascertain if it's a good fit for you, the better you're going to be able to write good essays, the more likely you're going to be to get in. So it's just good. It's a good practice as an applicant, no matter what. Another question was about, is test optional really test optional? I think that I've answered that. I think the easiest way to say it, though, because I've kind of talked about it in the context of other things, is test optional is test optional, meaning that if you haven't been able to test, that you aren't going to be penalized for not submitting, meaning they're not going to just count you out for not submitting. But I would encourage students who can get scores that are in the range for where they're applying, that you should continue taking the tests, and that you should try to submit scores if you can. And so those two things can be true at the same time, that it's preferable if you can submit scores to do so, and that you won't be penalized if you don't. And so think of it kind of that way, and think about what you can do in terms of what kind of scores you can present. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is actually really important, is that, again, we've seen colleges behave in unexpected ways. Just a few days ago, University of Michigan sent out an email to students who had either started or completed their applications. And it said, there was like, we've seen that you've started your application. Thank you so much. Here are the things you need to be mindful of. And it talked about test optional. And then there was like a little asterisk. And then you went down and you saw that they said that it was optional to submit test scores, that if you weren't submitting test scores, that you should use the optional COVID essay to explain why. That is not on their website. That was never communicated as part of their policy. We did see when Michigan announced that they were test optional, that they really seemed to be doing it because they absolutely had to, not because they wanted to. The language at the beginning pointed more towards test flexible, and then they kind of made it clear that it was test optional. And now suddenly we get this. Now, I'll be curious to see if they stick with it, because there's already been some pushback from the counseling community, but they never said that. And there are students who, rightly so, were prepping for ACTs or SATs when the test optional news came out. And now, by the way, we have more than 70% of colleges test optional this year. It's an extraordinary number. It's harder to find a place that's not test optional than that is. And so if you were a student who was like, great student, and there's so many of you out there like this, I know, great student, fantastic extracurricular activities, but the testing just wasn't where it needed to be for the kinds of schools that your transcript and the rest of your profile would suggest you should be applying. We all knew before that there are certain points where your scores just would make you not competitive enough, and it just wouldn't have been worth, the effort to apply, because you basically knew that it was going to knock you out. Now those students said, hey, if I'm sitting here struggling at, like, I can't seem to get out of like the high 20s, and I'm giving you examples of people that I literally am working with, the scores just weren't moving far enough, but beautiful transcripts, but again, just crummy testing relative, to where their transcripts were. There were people where strategically we said, listen, you don't have to continue and knock yourself out for these exams, because you're not going to realistically be able to hit where you need to hit in order to, use scores. And so those students made a decision that they weren't going to put the extra effort in to try and make sure that they tested at a certain point. Now, if they would have known that they would have to have shared that information, that it wasn't just test optional, period, then they might have made a different decision. And so Michigan coming out with that additional, kind of piece of information, if you would, is a real big thing. It's a big thing, and it's not what they're supposed to be doing. And the question will be: are they going to require that response? And will students potentially who who weren't going to send scores, might some people who were on the borderline sitting there with scores that were borderline, thinking, you know what, actually think my application would look stronger without the borderline scores. Now maybe they're going to consider doing it. So I'm following it very, very closely to see whether or not this is required, and also to see kind of what the language is back from Michigan, as they're hearing feedback. But, you've got things like that coming up, which goes back to the question of, should I just forget about the scores and the tests? No, you shouldn't. And it also means that you have to pay close attention to all of these things coming out of all the different schools. There is some funkiness this year that may impact strategy. Another thing that I always tell my students, we have their applications are done well in advance of any deadline, but we never submit super early, unless it's a rolling admission school, which is so few schools these days. So it really hardly ever comes into play. I can think of like a couple of schools, St. Andrews, Tulane, throw those applications in earlier, but mostly you're not doing it. So once you submit your application, the application locks for that particular school. So if suddenly Michigan announces that, you have to explain why you're not submitting scores, and maybe for you, it's not that you couldn't get to a testing center, it's that you decided, given everything, it didn't make sense to continue trying for these tests. If your application has locked and now you need to submit an answer, or maybe now you want to send scores, or maybe, you just might be changing your strategy. And this is an anomaly, what's happening in this particular school in this particular year. But I always tell students that you want to keep control over your application, not for as long as possible. Don't be sitting there on Halloween submitting November 1st applications. That's just unwise. But wait until the 26th, the 27th. You're still submitting well in advance of when most people submit, although it doesn't matter when anybody submits. They're not looking and saying this person submitted on the 25th and this person submitted on the 23rd, so the 23rd person wants to come more. It's none of that. They're not paying any attention. There's no benefit to you to submitting super early. So if your application is done, let it sit. Let it sit. First of all, you'll go back and proof it later with like the freshest eyes possible, which is always a good thing. But let it sit. The worst thing that happens is that, you submit it the way it was supposed to be submitted. Nothing came up and you held on to it for a few extra weeks or even months sometimes in our case. But plenty of times people are always surprised at things that will come up on their end. They got a cool opportunity, or something great happened in one of their activities that was unexpected, or, whatever. Or they go back and they look at their essay and there's a sentence they realize actually doesn't make as good a sense as it seemed to make, when they were writing it. So hang on to your applications. Don't rush to submit. Don't wait until the last minute, but keep control over your stuff, to the point at which it's strategic for you to do so. Because again, with a couple of exceptions, there's really no benefit to submitting super early. And you want to give the most complete application you possibly can. You don't want to keep writing to them, oh, by the way, add this. Oh, can you change that? And one other thing before we end, because I'm going to end at the hour, and I'm so sorry, we have questions that I didn't get to here and more questions, a ton of questions that came in advance. But when it comes to, what was I going to say? There was an important thing I was going to say, and now I'm forgetting it, and I said I had to leave you with it. We were talking about submitting the applications. If I don't remember before I sign off, I will send this to you in an email as a follow-up. And tomorrow night I'll be on our live on Instagram, as I am every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. So you can come on there and ask me, and I'll make sure I remember. But there is an important point that I wanted to leave you with, but give me a break because it's October 20th and we're in the thick of things and in the home stretch before the big November 1st deadline, and it has escaped me. But in any case, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure to get your questions. I loved the questions. They were super smart and they were really, really fun for me to answer. I hope they were helpful for you to hear the answers too. Please follow us on Instagram. I'm on there every day giving tips and advice on our stories, and you can DM me there and ask questions. We also would love to hear feedback from you. What would be helpful content or helpful services that we can offer? So please, please, please engage with us. Let us know what you think. And I'm more than happy to tailor content based on what parents and students might find helpful. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you'll join us at our next webinar. I'll be doing more Ask Me Anything, so keep an eye on your inbox, and have a great night and good luck to everybody applying this year and preparing for the next cycle.